A ceasefire doesn't necessarily collapse due to a large-scale airstrike. In many cases, it begins to fracture from a maritime interdiction, a coercive seizure at sea. And right now, that is the flashpoint between the U.S. and Iran. Reuters reports that Washington claims to have seized an Iranian cargo ship allegedly attempting to breach a blockade, while Tehran immediately signaled it will retaliate. The key point is this. This is no longer an isolated maritime incident. It is a direct test of the durability of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire, which is set to expire on Tuesday, the 21st of April, 2026. At the same time, the next diplomatic channel is heavily overshadowed, as Iran announced it will not participate in the new round of negotiations that Washington wants to push forward before that deadline. Militarily, such an interception is a signal of strategic coercion, not a routine patrol maneuver. Whichever side controls the sea lines of communication and imposes de facto control over shipping routes holds the leverage. In the Middle East, that leverage is directly tied to the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that Reuters highlights handles about 1/5 of global oil supplies. In short, this isn't just about one detained ship. It's an indicator that current state of détente is much thinner than its diplomatic surface. When a coercive action at sea is enough to shake both the ceasefire and the negotiating table, the situation is clearly hovering right at the threshold of escalation. This crisis didn't start with the seizure of the vessel. It is the consequence of a chain of coercive measures that have been escalating step by step for weeks. According to Reuters, the U.S. maintains a naval blockade on Iranian ports, while Tehran tightens its control over maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. When both sides use the maritime domain as an instrument of coercion, the sea is no longer just a commercial route. It becomes a maritime pressure zone with distinct military and strategic significance. Hormuz isn't just a choke point on a map. It is a vital sea line of communication for the global energy market. Therefore, any interdiction, traffic control, or maritime coercion here goes far beyond the scope of a bilateral U.S.-Iran confrontation. It instantly impacts oil prices, marine insurance, supply chains, and the operational rhythm of the entire international energy security system. In this context, the latest incident is a substantive escalation, not merely a symbolic one. Reuters reports that the U.S. military stated they have seized an Iranian cargo ship accused of trying to run the blockade. Footage cited by Reuters shows the vessel, the MV Touska, intercepted by the USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, equipped with the Aegis combat system. This demonstrates that Washington isn't just declaring a blockade on paper, but has shifted to interdiction enforcement using frontline naval assets. That's why this seizure is more dangerous than it appears. Reuters notes the conflict has entered its 8th week, while shipping traffic in and out of the Gulf has been reduced to a bare minimum, and the oil market has reacted immediately. In other words, this event didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred exactly when maritime pressure, energy security, and the ceasefire were colliding at the same strategic intersection. To properly read the severity of this event, one must look at the operational details, not just the headlines. Reuters identified the seized ship as the MV Touska and the intercepting asset as the USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with the Aegis combat system. That combination alone shows this wasn't a routine maritime inspection, but a maritime interdiction backed by frontline U.S. naval capabilities. The next crucial point is the nature of this action. Reuters reports the U.S. stated the Iranian ship tried to breach the blockade, and Washington claims full control of the vessel following the interception. Doctrinally, this isn't just a signaling of presence, it's the transition from a blockade declaration to blockade enforcement. When an Aegis destroyer is used to coerce a civilian target, flying an adversary's flag, the message sent isn't just political symbolism, it's a signal of on-the-ground control over the shipping lane. Reuters also highlights a detail with broader strategic implications. Iran says the ship departed from China. This pushes the incident beyond the bilateral U.S.-Iran framework, directly touching Asian trade networks and parties reliant on Gulf shipping routes. A maritime seizure in such a context affects not only maritime security, but also the risk perception of the shipping industry, insurers, and energy importing partners. On the diplomatic front, Reuters reports that Washington still intends to hold a second round of talks in Islamabad before the ceasefire expires on Tuesday, the 21st of April, 2026. But Tehran has declared it will not attend, citing the ongoing U.S. blockade and conditions that Iran rejects. In other words, the diplomatic channel hasn't vanished, but the political space for de-escalation has significantly narrowed. Pakistan is still preparing for the talks as a high-level security event. Reuters notes that 2 U.S. C-17 aircraft have delivered security equipment and vehicles to Islamabad. Public transport is suspended, and barbed wire has been deployed around the host hotel. This indicates that the logistical machinery for negotiations is still running, but the signals from the ground are moving in the opposite direction. And that is the most dangerous point. While the infrastructure for diplomacy is still being erected, out at sea, the mechanism of coercion has pushed both sides closer to the threshold of retaliation. This interception doesn't just create direct military risks, it immediately generates strategic-level effects. Reuters reports that following the latest developments, oil prices surged and stock markets wavered as traders assessed that vessel traffic in and out of the Gulf may remain at a bare minimum. This shows it's no longer an isolated maritime incident, but a shock to global energy security and market psychology. Strategically, Tehran is broadcasting a very clear message. Reuters quotes Iranian First Vice President Mohammad Reza Aref, "You cannot squeeze Iran's oil exports and expect free maritime security for other countries." In other words, Iran is turning the oil flow and maritime security into bargaining chips. If the country is choked off from exporting, they will drive up the risk premium across the entire Hormuz shipping system. The more dangerous element is that the axis of escalation is shifting from vessels to critical infrastructure. Reuters reports that President Trump threatened to destroy Iran's bridges and power plants if Tehran rejects U.S. conditions. In response, Iran warned that power and desalination plants in nearby Arab countries hosting U.S. bases could also become targets. This is a highly notable shift, from confrontation at sea to deterrence via the capability to strike vital infrastructure, expanding the coercive space from sea denial to infrastructure coercion at a regional level. Reuters also notes a fracture in the Western approach. European allies worry that Washington is pushing for a fast but shallow deal, whereas core issues like Iran's nuclear program and control over Hormuz will require months, if not years, of subsequent technical negotiations. This means that even if a new ceasefire framework is reached, it risks being merely an operational pause rather than a structure for strategic stability. At this moment, the most likely scenario isn't long-term stability, but a temporary de-escalation with a very high risk of collapse. Reuters reports the current ceasefire will expire on Tuesday, the 21st of April 2026, while Iran has announced it will not join the next round of talks Washington wants to push in Islamabad. Those two facts alone show that the political space to maintain the ceasefire is rapidly shrinking. The first scenario is a localized collapse of the ceasefire that doesn't immediately translate into all-out war.
The reason is that both sides still leave room for a certain degree of diplomatic flexibility, even as the signals on the ground are becoming distinctly more coercive. But Reuters also shows Tehran has described the ship's seizure as an act of armed piracy and vowed to respond. This means the risk of limited retaliation at sea against commercial shipping or at nodes related to energy flows is entirely realistic. The second scenario is escalation along the sea energy critical infrastructure axis. Reuters notes the renewed tensions have driven up oil prices, rattled stocks, and sent capital fleeing into safe haven assets like the USD. This reflects a strategic reality. In the Hormuz environment, you don't need a massive naval campaign to create a global effect. A string of interdictions, threats of retaliation, and the risk of shipping disruptions are enough to shake the markets. The third scenario is that talks happen, but only to buy time without addressing the root causes. Reuters notes European allies are concerned Washington is seeking a quick agreement lacking technical depth, while core dossiers like Iran's nuclear program and de facto control over Hormuz will require much longer and more complex rounds of negotiation. In other words, even if the guns fall silent temporarily, the structure of the conflict remains intact. And that is the most important conclusion. The seizure of an Iranian cargo ship is not just a tactical incident, it exposes the true nature of this confrontation. Whichever side controls the sea lines of communication holds the strategic leverage. Whoever holds that leverage can simultaneously pressure ceasefires, negotiations, and energy markets. In such an environment, the current peace is not a stable state. It is merely a brief pause between cycles of escalation.